All right, so we are in this series called Made, and it's a series that is all about some of the awkward things that we don't often talk about in church. See, we believe that all of us were made with a purpose. We talked about this last week. We talked about how our body goes through phases like puberty, where just things kind of go different in our lives when it comes to our development and the way that we look and the way that we sound and in the places hair grows, and it's all kinds of fun stuff. And this week we're going to talk about some of the other things that God has made with a purpose. Made in such a way that is to bring honor to Him, and which will ultimately bring joy and satisfaction to our lives. And so I do want to start with a warning, which I kind of mentioned earlier, that this may get a little awkward. So if you start to feel awkward, then just know that it's probably because I'm tripping over this rug here. If it starts to get a little awkward, just know that it's natural to feel awkward during this conversation because it's a new topic for many of you. It's a topic that is often not addressed from a public setting like this, and if it does and it happens in school, there's lots of giggles going on, you know what I mean? And so this is a conversation that, hey, let's just be real. It's weird to talk about sometimes, but it's really important because as weird as it is to talk about, I think that's the way the devil likes to get at us, because he makes it weird for us to talk about, so we don't talk about. We just act upon how we feel. And when we just act upon how we feel without actually being able to have a conversation about it, it causes lots of issues. And so this is a topic that, I asked you, when it comes to sex, what are your thoughts about it? And I had several of you write down stuff there at the beginning, so I'm just going to pull some of those things out. One of you wrote, why did God make it this way? That's a good question. You should ask Him that sometime. But God did make it this way. There you go. Okay. I've heard that you can make a baby by doing it. That is correct information, kind sir or ma'am. Whoever wrote this, I don't know. What I have heard about sex is that you could get STDs and make a baby. Another true statement about sex. I'm not going to go through all of those. I did briefly check at those earlier, and a lot of you said, I don't know. And I don't think it's because you don't know. I think it's because you don't want to write it down, especially with somebody sitting next to you, and that's okay. But the idea is that there are so many different thoughts and ideas about sex. About, is there a correct orientation? Is there a correct time to do it? When is it okay to express the feelings that I feel when it comes to sex? And there's lots of opinions about all of those answers. And in fact, you don't have to go very far to hear those different opinions and answers about that. All of us have our own opinions and our own thoughts. All of us have the things that we've heard, the things that we come to understand about this topic. And unfortunately, when a lot of us feel awkward about talking about it, we don't ask the questions to get the right answers. We just kind of go with what we hear first. Or go with what we hear the most, maybe. And that's a natural human reaction. So, what I want to do and what I want to accomplish with this series is talk about this in such a way that is God-honoring and that is informative and truthful for you to understand from God's perspective why this was designed and what it is we are supposed to do with it, especially as 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Because my bet is you don't have to wander very far in your schools to hear an answer on this. You don't have to wander too far outside the bathroom to hear the conversations people have when it comes to this topic. And so, and even if you get on YouTube or watch Netflix, how many of you guys love to watch Netflix, by the way? I love watching Netflix. But you know what? I can hardly ever find a show that doesn't talk about sexual things in a way that is not honoring to God. So we have a lot of ideas that we hear on a constant rotating basis about sex. And what I want you guys to know before we go any further is that God made sex and He made you. Because there's a couple of different extremes when it comes to this topic that we tend to hear about. And because God created it, He does have some expectations about it. So I think we should analyze these two views that we tend to hear. And one is, especially if you come to church for a long period of time, or maybe you grew up in a Christian home, or maybe just a home that kind of still has some traditional views on this topic, then you're probably left with the impression, even if the words weren't said this way, you might have been left with the impression that sex is bad. How many of you have gotten that impression that sex is bad? Sex is something you should stay away from. It's great when you get married, but don't do it till then, right? Right? Don't have sex. Don't even think about it. Don't look anything up in Google that has anything to do with sex. Nothing. No, it's bad. Stay away from it. Run from it with your life, right? You've probably heard something along those lines. When it comes to this, though, we hear a lot of times because maybe you're not old enough yet. Maybe it's not appropriate for you to be expressing yourself in this way. So what we say is it's bad. And maybe we don't say it's bad, but we leave you with the impression that it is bad, that sex is bad. But I want to remind you that God made you and God made sex. So it does have a purpose. And that purpose is not bad. Anything God makes cannot be bad. So if it's not that extreme, then what other extreme do we hear? The other extreme we hear when it comes to sex is that it's casual. That it doesn't matter. It's something to be experimented with. You need to find what your likings are. You need to experience your own sexuality and experiment with it, how you should utilize those feelings that you have when it comes to this topic. And we hear that in the music that we listen to, we hear it in the movies we watch, the TV shows we consume, that we binge watch, because let's be honest, binge watching TV shows is a lot of fun. It's in, every part of life, it seems, on YouTube and in school. The number one thing that we hear is it's not a big deal. It just doesn't matter. Why do Christians make such a big deal about this? It doesn't matter. It's just physical. It's just body parts and nerve endings. It doesn't matter. It's casual. And those are the two extremes we hear. That either it's bad or it's casual, and it shouldn't matter what we think about it. And both of those extremes, I would say, are incorrect. Because if God made you and He made sex and He made both with a purpose, then I believe it has a little bit more meaning than it's just casual, it doesn't matter. And I don't believe that it's bad. So how do we talk about this in a way that is God honoring, that brings out the truth about why God created and what we as middle schoolers are supposed to do with it? This is important stuff. So let's go real quick to how we should think about sex. Because I think all of our actions follow our thoughts. And so how should we think about it? Well, Jesus actually had something to say about this. And in fact, we've talked from this book many times. It's something that Matthew wrote down, one of his apostles. It's the first gospel, the first book in the New Testament, which is actually kind of a document, not really a book. And he's writing from the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave, where he goes, and we talked on this passage many a times, and Jesus is talking, and he gives this like 3 chapter long sermon to people on the side of the mountain. And in this sermon, there's a little part where he talks about how we should think about sex. In fact, this is what he says in chapter 5, verse 27. He says that you have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Now, let's talk about that, because we don't use the phrase commit adultery very often, right? Unless we're talking about Bible terms, right? Or the 10 Commandments. So let's go over what this means. When he says you shall not commit adultery, what he's talking about, and what people understood about that phrase in this time, is that means you should not have sex with someone who is not your spouse. That's what it means. And so Jesus is saying, you've heard that it was said you should not commit adultery. And then he goes on. Next verse he says, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, let's kind of dissect that, because there's lots of, commit adultery, lustfully. What do all those mean? Well, let's talk about this for a second. Because you guys are at the age where it's totally normal, it's totally natural for you to start noticing people in such a way that you get excited, that you start to develop feelings, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of what those feelings are, because, unfortunately, it is everywhere. But it's okay to look at someone and to feel an attraction towards them. That's normal. That's natural. But lust means that you look at somebody not as a person, but as an object to satisfy a desire that you have. So when you look at somebody to make you feel good sexually, and you think about that in your head, that's what's called lust. So when Jesus is saying, it's not just about not having sex with someone you're not married to. Like, it's more than that, it's deeper than that. It begins with your thoughts about the very act you're thinking. If you even think about someone, and it doesn't have to be a woman, this can be applied to men too. Just men happen to be more visual than women most of the time. So that's why he uses this example. But if you look at another person with sexual intent, imagining what it would be like to be with them in a sexual way, that is lust. And that's something that Jesus says, that's not your spouse. It doesn't matter if you're actually doing it or not, you're thinking about it. And when you think about that person in that way, you're objectifying them. You are making them out to be an object. Not someone that I have made with a purpose and a design and with love. No, when you look at somebody lustfully, you take the personhood out of that and you start looking at them like an object. And that's why Jesus says not to do it. He says not to do it because, not just because it's bad for you, which science has actually proven, we can talk about that another time, but because it shapes your view of people in general. You stop viewing people as God's creation. You stop viewing people as made in the image of God, and you start viewing people as a means to please your desires. And that's where Jesus says, hey, that's not why I created that person. And that's why this is such a big deal. The way that we think about sex is just as important as the way that we act on those thoughts. And as we know, all thoughts lead to action. All action derived itself from a thought. So when Jesus is saying this 2,000 years ago, it was a pretty big deal because nobody ever talked about sex in this way. And in fact, women were, when he says you shouldn't look at a woman lustfully, women were viewed as property anyway in this time. And so not only is Jesus giving value to something that society didn't value to begin with, he's also doing it while talking about a subject that they didn't talk about in that way. So today, when people say that Christianity is all about, toxic masculinity and taking away the rights of women and stuff, that's just not true. Jesus, the founder of Christianity, the person for whom Christians follow, actually set a different standard, that actually women are on equal footing as men. They're not the same, but they are equal in the eyes of God. Men and women have differences. Many of you are beginning to notice those differences now. So, they're not the same, but they are equal in the sight of God. It should be in our eyes. When it comes to sex, we weren't made to be treated like objects. And last week we talked about the verse that David wrote from Psalm chapter 139, which says, I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And so this is why this is such a big deal. Because we were made with a sense of awe and inspiration by our Creator. And so this is why we're going to be talking about this week. Not because we want to tell you what to do with your life or squander your freedom and tell you can't do anything, but because we believe that God made you, and he made you with a design and a purpose, and we believe he made sex for a design and a purpose. And we're going to be talking about this actually for the next couple of weeks, because there's a lot to unpack when it comes to this. There's a lot of baggage, there's a lot of stuff that we have to kind of dissect and retrain ourselves about when it comes to this topic, because I don't know if you guys have looked around lately, but our society just has this all kinds of messed up, and it has caused so much pain. And some of you have been the recipients of pain because of sexual sin. And so this is a huge deal that we want to talk about, because right now you guys are in your formative years. When I say that, what I mean is you guys are in the part of your life where your brains are developing like more rapidly than what they will ever again in your life. And the way that you think now has the power to impact the way that you think as an adult. And that's why it is so important to remind ourselves of God's truths in the midst of our crazy lives. Because God made all of us are valuable. So, just application, a couple questions I want you guys to be thinking about when it comes to this is the first question, how can I view others with value? So when you see other people, and this applies to all areas of life, not just this topic. When you see other people, how do you view them in such a way that gives value to them? Not in a way to make fun of them, not in a way to demean them, not in a way to treat them like objects in your mind, but how can you view somebody the way God views people? So how can I view others with value? And secondly, why should I view others with value? Well, and as you think about this question, I want you to think about this. Do you have value? Do you believe that you have value? And if you answer no, then I'd love to talk with you about that later, because God says each and every one of us has an amount of value that nobody could, not all the money in the world could buy. Each of us have an intrinsic value because He made us, because He loves us so more than we could ever even imagine. But if you believe that you have value, if you believe that your life has a purpose, and you want to make a difference with your life, then you have to assume that the same is true for everybody. For you to assume that you have a special purpose and someone else doesn't is pretty arrogant, honestly. So if you believe that you have value, then it means you must believe that other people have value as well. So why should you view others with value? I want you to be thinking about that question. How can I view others with value, and why should I view others with value? As Jesus reminded us, God made us all, so we are all valuable. As you get ready to go to your small groups, I want you to think about this one question. What's one way I can give value to others with my thoughts? Thank you guys so much for listening and for participating in the small group discussion you're about to partake in. I want you guys to know you are each loved. We care about you guys. And thanks for sticking with us through this conversation. I'm going to pray for you, and you'll go to your groups.